For over a century, scientists told us a simple story. Two ancestral groups gave birth to the Japanese people. One story, 2 chapters, case closed, textbooks repeated it, museums displayed it, generations of students memorized it without question. But when researchers cracked open the DNA of a woman who died 3,000 years ago on the shores of Fukushima, that story didn't just get more complicated, it fell apart entirely. Because buried inside her bones was a signal that shouldn't have been there. A genetic fingerprint that predates everything we thought we knew about who the Japanese people actually are. Her name is lost to history, and archaeologists simply call her Sanganji, after the shell mound where her remains were found, tucked into layers of ash and soil that had protected her for 30 centuries. She was buried alongside a man, both of them part of a culture we call the Jōmon, a people who lived across the Japanese archipelago for more time than most civilizations have existed at all. When scientists finally sequenced fragments of her genome, they expected confirmation of what they already believed. What they got instead was a genetic anomaly so strange that it forced an entire field to start over. To understand why this discovery mattered so much, you have to go back to the story everyone believed before her bones spoke. For most of the 20th century, anthropologists built what they called the dual structure model. It was elegant. It was simple. It said that modern Japanese people descended from exactly 2 ancestral populations. The first were the Jōmon, hunter-gatherers who arrived in the Japanese islands tens of thousands of years ago and lived there in relative isolation, fishing, foraging, and crafting some of the oldest pottery ever discovered anywhere on Earth. The second were the Yayoi, a wave of migrants who arrived from the Asian mainland around 300 years before the Common Era, bringing with them something that would change everything: rice agriculture. According to this model, the Jōmon were pushed to the margins, absorbed or replaced as Yayoi farmers spread across the islands, planting rice paddies where hunting grounds once stood. Over centuries, the theory went, these 2 populations mixed, and the result was the modern Japanese population we see today. It was a clean narrative. A hunter-gatherer culture meets an agricultural culture, and the fusion of the 2 produces a nation. For decades, skull measurements, blood types, and early genetic markers seemed to support it. Scientists were confident. The story was settled. Except it wasn't. Because a settled story is exactly the kind of story that reality loves to break. The first cracks appeared quietly, buried in academic journals that most people never read. Researchers sequencing ancient DNA from Jōmon remains kept finding something odd. The genetic signature of the Jōmon people wasn't simply an early version of East Asian ancestry. It was something else, something that seemed to branch off from the rest of humanity's family tree earlier than expected, before the populations of East Asia had even fully formed and diversified. When scientists compared Jōmon DNA to modern populations across the world, from East Asians to Native Americans to the peoples of Oceania, the Jōmon didn't neatly cluster with anyone. They sat in a strange, isolated position of their own, closer to the center of major population groups than any of them individually, as if they represented something ancestral, something foundational, a branch of humanity that split away and vanished into isolation before the rest of the story had even been written. This alone should have been a red flag for the simple 2 population model. But the real turning point came when researchers began comparing full Yayoi genomes, not just partial fragments, to the Jōmon and to modern Japanese populations. If the dual structure model were correct, Yayoi individuals should have looked almost entirely like continental East Asian farmers, with only a small trace of Jōmon ancestry picked up through mixing after their arrival. Instead, researchers found something that didn't fit the formula at all. Yayoi individuals carried not 2, but 3 distinct genetic ancestries. One was clearly Jōmon, one was linked to East Asian populations from the south, but the third came from somewhere entirely different. A northeastern Siberian-related lineage, a genetic thread connecting the ancient people of Japan to populations far to the north, across the Sea of Japan, in landscapes shaped by ice and cold rather than rice paddies and warm river valleys. This was the moment the entire field had to pause and reconsider. If Yayoi people already carried 3 ancestries before they had even fully settled and mixed within Japan, then the old 2 population story wasn't just incomplete, it was wrong. Something else had happened in the deep past. Some other group, some other migration, some other population had contributed to the genetic makeup of the people who would eventually become the Japanese. And it had been hiding in plain sight for thousands of years, undetected because nobody had the tools to see it. Scientists now call this the tripartite model, a genetic origin story built not on 2 ancestral pillars, but on 3. The Jōmon, the ancient hunter-gatherers who called the islands home for over 10,000 years. A wave of East Asian continental migrants, arriving with agriculture and new technologies. And a third, mysterious northeastern component, A population whose exact identity is still being pieced together, whose DNA nonetheless flows through the veins of tens of millions of people who have never heard their name. Think about what that means. Every time you picture the ancient history of Japan, you're picturing an incomplete story. Every documentary, every museum exhibit built on the old model was missing an entire branch of the family tree. And this isn't ancient trivia locked away in a dusty archive somewhere. Genetic studies using massive modern biobank data, sequencing hundreds of thousands of living people, have confirmed that this tripartite ancestry isn't just a historical curiosity. It's written into the genome of nearly every person of Japanese descent alive today. Roughly 13% Jōmon, roughly 16% from the Yayoi wave, and the rest split between later migrations, including a third, even more recent wave known as the Kofun, named for the massive burial mounds that dot the Japanese landscape from that era, when state formation and political centralization began to take shape across the islands. But if the three ancestry model rewrote the story once, it wasn't the last time the story would need rewriting. Because the deeper scientists dug into the Jōmon themselves, the more it became clear that even calling them a single unified population was an oversimplification. The Jōmon weren't one people, they were many peoples, spread across an archipelago that stretches over 2,000 miles from the icy north to the subtropical south, and their DNA tells wildly different stories depending on where you look. Consider the Ryukyu Islands, the long chain of subtropical islands stretching south from the main Japanese archipelago toward Taiwan. For a long time, the Jōmon people who lived there were treated as a regional variant of the same broader population found on the mainland. But when researchers sequenced hundreds of modern genomes alongside dozens of ancient samples from the region, spanning nearly 7,000 years of history, they found something remarkable. The Ryukyu Jōmon and the mainland Jōmon had split apart from each other so long ago and so completely that they represented two genuinely distinct lineages. This divergence happened nearly 7,000 years before the present, an ocean of time separating two branches of what everyone had assumed was a single cultural and genetic group. And it gets stranger. After that split, the Ryukyu Jōmon population appears to have gone through a dramatic bottleneck, a period where their numbers shrank so severely that their entire lineage nearly vanished. Imagine an entire branch of human history balancing on the edge of extinction, surviving through sheer resilience in isolated island environments, cut off from the larger currents of migration and mixing happening on the mainland. It wasn't until around 1,000 years ago that this isolated southern population began mixing again with people from the main islands, a moment in history that lines up with major cultural shifts in the region, including the arrival of iron tools and the intensification of agriculture in the central Ryukyu Islands. For thousands of years before that, an entire distinct branch of humanity lived, adapted, and nearly disappeared, almost entirely unknown to the people, living just a few hundred miles to the north. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the Jōmon weren't one people, but many, if entire lineages nearly vanished in isolation, without anyone on the mainland knowing they existed, how many other branches like this are still waiting to be found, buried in shell mounds and cave floors across the archipelago, holding genetic secrets that haven't been sequenced yet? This isn't just a question for academics locked away in laboratories. It has real consequences for millions of ordinary people today. Consumer ancestry testing has exploded in popularity over the past decade, with companies promising to tell customers exactly where their bloodlines come from, breaking down their heritage into neat percentages and colorful regional maps. But the discovery of a deep divide between Ryukyu and mainland Jomon lineages complicates that entire industry. A simple, single-source narrative of Japanese ancestry no longer holds up under scrutiny. Someone with roots tracing back to the southern islands may carry a genetic signature meaningfully different from someone whose ancestors lived on the northern mainland, even if both would have been labeled simply Japanese under older, cruder classification systems. As ancestry testing becomes more sophisticated, more granular, people may start to see these distinctions appear directly in their own personal results, distinctions that didn't exist in the databases used just a few years earlier because the underlying science hadn't caught up yet. And this pattern isn't unique to Japan. It's a warning sign for how we think about ancestry and ethnicity everywhere. For generations, we've been comfortable collapsing entire populations into single labels, single boxes, single simplified stories. Japanese, Chinese, Korean, European, African. But the more ancient DNA researchers dig, the more these labels reveal themselves to be crude approximations of something far more layered and complicated. Populations we assumed were genetically uniform turn out to be mosaics, stitched together from multiple ancestral threads, shaped by isolation, migration, near extinction, and reconnection over spans of time that dwarf recorded human history. The Jōmon story is a case study in just how wrong our assumptions can be when we mistake cultural or linguistic unity for genetic uniformity. There's also a deeper implication buried in this research, and one that goes beyond ancestry percentages and into the realm of human resilience itself. The fact that the Ryokyu Jomon population survived a severe bottleneck, a period where their numbers shrank so dramatically that extinction must have felt like a very real possibility, and still managed to persist for thousands of years in isolation before reconnecting with the wider population, says something profound about the durability of small, isolated human groups. It echoes what we see in other extreme environments around the world, from Arctic populations to remote island communities, groups that faced seemingly impossible odds of survival and somehow endured anyway, their genetic legacy quietly persisting long after the rest of the world assumed they had vanished entirely. It also forces us to reconsider how we define a civilization in the first place. We tend to associate the word with grand monuments, written language, centralized governments, and sprawling cities. But the Jomon had none of those things for most of their existence, and yet they built something arguably just as remarkable: a durable, adaptive, biologically distinct population that outlasted an ice age, survived near extinction in isolated pockets, and quietly shaped the genetic foundation of an entire modern nation. Their legacy isn't written in stone monuments or ancient texts. It's written directly into the cells of the people walking through the streets of Tokyo and Okinawa today, most of whom have never heard the word Jomon at all. But perhaps the most astonishing discovery of all doesn't come from where the Jomon came from, or how many branches they split into. It comes from how they survived. Because to understand the Jomon, you have to understand the world they were born into, and that world was trying to kill them. Roughly 29,000 years ago, the planet plunged into one of the coldest periods in the entire history of modern humans. Scientists call it the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, a period lasting roughly 10,000 years during which global temperatures dropped so severely that ice sheets expanded across huge portions of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels fell dramatically as water became locked away in glaciers. Landscapes that we know today as ocean were exposed as dry land. And somewhere in the middle of this frozen, transformed world, a population of humans found themselves isolated on the emerging Japanese archipelago, cut off as rising and falling seas repeatedly reshaped the coastline, stranded in an environment that had no mercy for the unprepared. This should not have been survival. Modern humans, evolved in warmer climates over hundreds of thousands of years, are not naturally built for prolonged extreme cold. Yet the ancestors of the Jomon didn't just survive the last glacial maximum. They thrived through it, adapted to it, and passed something extraordinary down through their bloodline, something so deeply written into their biology that traces of it remain detectable in their descendants today, tens of thousands of years later. Researchers investigating this mystery turn to one of the most reliable sources of ancient DNA available, the petrous bone, a remarkably dense structure located deep inside the inner ear. Unlike other bones in the human skeleton, the petrous bone is incredibly resistant to degradation, capable of preserving genetic material in far better condition than almost anywhere else in the body, even after tens of thousands of years buried in soil and sediment. By extracting and sequencing DNA from 42 ancient Jomon individuals using this method, scientists were able to reconstruct not just where these people came from, but how their bodies had physically adapted to survive an ice age that should have wiped them out. What they found was staggering. The Jomon carried unusually high frequencies of specific genetic variants tied directly to how the human body generates and regulates heat. 3 genes in particular stood out. One called UCP1, which plays a critical role in a special kind of fat tissue known as brown fat, tissue that doesn't just store energy the way ordinary fat does, but actively burns it to produce heat, essentially functioning as an internal furnace. Another gene, FTO, closely tied to metabolism and how the body manages fat storage and energy expenditure. And a third, APOA5, involved in regulating fat levels in the bloodstream. Together, these genetic variants suggest something remarkable. The Jomon may have possessed an enhanced ability to generate heat internally, allowing their bodies to stay warm in brutal cold without needing to shiver constantly, a survival advantage that would have been the difference between life and death during thousands of years spent enduring one of the harshest climates in human history. This wasn't a cultural adaptation, like clothing or fire. This was written into their biology, into the very mechanisms their cells use to convert fuel into warmth. Think about what this means on a human level. Somewhere on the frozen edge of the world, tens of thousands of years ago, small groups of people were quite literally evolving in real time, their bodies reshaping themselves at the genetic level in response to a climate trying to erase them. Those who carried these heat-generating variants had a survival advantage. They were more likely to make it through brutal winters, more likely to reproduce, more likely to pass those same genes on to their children. Generation after generation, this selective pressure sculpted their biology until an entire population carried the genetic signature of survival against impossible odds. And the truly remarkable part is that this signature didn't disappear when the Ice Age ended. Researchers using sophisticated genetic reconstruction tools, techniques capable of tracing family trees and population relationships across tens of thousands of years, found that these cold adaptation genes persist. They're still there, diluted through thousands of years of migration and mixing, but detectable, present in the DNA of people living in Japan today who have absolutely no idea that they're carrying a genetic memory of an ice age. Their ancestors survived nearly 30,000 years ago. This is what makes the story of the Jomon so much more than an academic curiosity. This isn't just about tracing bloodlines or building family trees stretching back into prehistory. This is about the physical, biological reality of survival under conditions almost none of us can truly imagine. While much of the rest of the world's population during the last glacial maximum could migrate toward warmer regions when climates shifted, the ancestors of the Jomon found themselves increasingly isolated, cut off by rising seas that separated the Japanese landmass from the Asian mainland somewhere between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago. There was no retreat, no warmer land to flee toward. They had one option: adapt or disappear. And adapt they did, not just physically, but culturally. Trapped on their island world, isolated from the rest of humanity for millennia, the Jomon developed something that still astonishes archaeologists today, some of the oldest pottery ever discovered anywhere on the planet. Technology developed independently, born out of necessity, out of the unique pressures of a population that had nowhere else to go, and had to build a life entirely from what their islands could provide. While other ancient human populations were still relying on baskets and skins to store food and water, the Jomon were shaping clay, firing it, creating vessels that would outlast their creators by more than 10,000 years. The isolation that nearly destroyed them also transformed them into innovators. For over 10,000 years, this pattern continued. The Jomon lived as hunters, gatherers, and fishers, moving through forests and coastlines, developing increasingly sophisticated tools and settlements, all while remaining fundamentally isolated from the genetic currents flowing through the rest of the Asian continent. This isolation is precisely why their DNA looks so strange, so foundational, so disconnected from the rest of humanity's family tree when compared to modern populations. They weren't just another regional variant of East Asian ancestry. They were something older, a population that had branched away before the diversification of East Asian populations had even fully occurred, sealed off on their island world, evolving along their own separate path for tens of thousands of years. But as we now know, these migrants weren't arriving into a genetic blank slate. They were arriving into a population that had already been shaped by tens of thousands of years of isolation, adaptation, and survival. And as we've seen, those Yayoi migrants themselves already carried a mysterious third ancestry, a northeastern component whose full story is still being untangled by researchers today. What followed was not a simple replacement, but a long, complex process of mixing, migration, and cultural transformation that would continue for centuries. The descendants of the Jomon didn't vanish. Their genes persisted, weaving themselves into the growing population that would eventually become the foundation of modern Japan. Even as agriculture spread, as populations grew, as political structures began to centralize during the later Kofun period, the deep genetic legacy of those Ice Age survivors never disappeared. It simply became diluted, distributed, folded into a much larger and more complex genetic tapestry. This is why modern genetic studies, using data from hundreds of thousands of living Japanese individuals, continue to find traces of Jomon ancestry in virtually every person of Japanese descent today. It's not a small footnote in a much larger story. It's a foundational thread running through the entire genetic fabric of a nation, connecting over 100 million people alive right now to a population that quite literally reshaped its own biology to survive an ice age that ended more than 10,000 years ago. And this raises a question that goes far beyond Japan itself. If an isolated population on a chain of islands could develop such a specific, detectable genetic adaptation to extreme cold, and if that adaptation could persist for tens of thousands of years, diluted through countless generations of migration and mixing, what does that tell us about human resilience more broadly? What other hidden genetic legacies are we still carrying, inherited from ancestors who faced environmental pressures we can barely imagine, adaptations that shaped who we are today in ways we're only now beginning to understand? The story of the Jōmon isn't just a story about Japan, it's a story about what it means to survive against odds that should have been insurmountable. It's a story about how isolation, rather than destroying a population, can sometimes forge something entirely new, a people whose biology, whose culture, whose very DNA becomes a monument to endurance. It's a story about how the past never truly disappears, how it hides instead, waiting in petrous bones and shell mounds in the quiet corners of our own genomes, until someone finally develops the tools needed to listen. And perhaps most remarkably, this story is still being written. The tripartite model that replaced the old dual structure theory may not be the final word either. The discovery of a deep split between mainland and Ryukyu Jomon lineages shows that even our newest models are likely incomplete, that there are almost certainly more branches, more isolated populations, more genetic secrets scattered across the Japanese archipelago waiting to be uncovered. Every shell mound excavated, every petrous bone sequenced, every ancient genome compared against the growing library of human genetic data has the potential to rewrite this story once again. Consider the sheer scale of what's being reconstructed here. Scientists using advanced computational tools, techniques capable of modeling population splits, migrations, and bottlenecks across tens of thousands of years, are essentially building a family tree for an entire nation, one genetic sample at a time. Each new ancient genome adds another branch, another data point, another piece of a puzzle that has been scattered across an archipelago for millennia. And with each new discovery, the picture becomes both clearer and more complicated at the same time, revealing a history far richer and far stranger than anyone could have guessed just a few decades ago. Think back to Sanganji, the woman whose bones started unraveling the old story. She lived and died 3,000 years ago on the coast of what is now Fukushima, entirely unaware that her remains would one day help overturn a century of scientific consensus. She couldn't have known that her DNA carried echoes of an ice age her ancestors endured nearly 30,000 years before her birth, or that fragments of her genetic code would eventually be compared to hundreds of thousands of living people across the modern world. She was simply living her life, part of a community that had endured, adapted, and persisted across an almost unimaginable span of time. She never saw a map of the world beyond her coastline, never imagined that researchers thousands of years in the future would extract fragments of her genetic code and compare them against samples pulled from every corner of the globe. She didn't know she was evidence. She was simply a person, living a life shaped by forests, tides, and the slow rhythm of the seasons, unaware that her body carried a record stretching back to a frozen world her distant ancestors had somehow survived. That record waited patiently in the ground for 3,000 years, undisturbed, until modern science finally learned how to ask her the right questions. And in a very real sense, she still is. Every time a new study emerges, every time researchers sequence another ancient genome from another shell mound or burial site, people like Sanganji speak again, offering fragments of a story that was nearly lost to time entirely. The old narrative, the simple two-population story that dominated textbooks for generations, has been replaced by something far more intricate. A story of multiple ancestral populations, of Ice Age survival written directly into human biology, of isolated lineages that nearly vanished before reconnecting with the wider world, of a nation whose genetic identity is not a single thread, but a woven tapestry stretching back tens of thousands of years. This is what makes ancient DNA research so extraordinary. It doesn't just confirm what we already believe, it challenges it, overturns it, and forces us to rebuild our understanding from the ground up. The story of the Jomon reminds us that history isn't fixed. It's not a finished book sitting on a shelf, waiting to be read and memorized. It's an ongoing investigation, constantly being rewritten as new evidence emerges from the ground, from bones, from fragments of genetic code that have survived against all odds. So the next time you hear a confident, settled story about where a people came from, about how a nation was formed, remember Sanganji. Remember the Ice Age survivors whose bodies quite literally reshaped themselves to endure a world trying to kill them. Remember the isolated lineages nearly lost to time, waiting patiently in shell mounds and cave floors for someone to finally listen. Because the truth, as it so often turns out, is far stranger, far older, and far more remarkable than the simple story we were told to believe. And there is likely still more waiting to be found, buried just beneath the surface in bones that haven't been touched in thousands of years, holding secrets about who we are and where we truly came from.